April 2022, I chose Patrick Lecture 129, which is Winner versus Loser, Interplay between the Self and the Creative Forces. And I had an unusual experience when reading this lecture. I was inspired to read it because of global events, because of the stress many people are feeling about global conflict, about national conflicts, about differences in point of view about governments and morals and values that have almost reached the 50-50 mark worldwide. So that it feels like these are not simply dissenting voices, these are civil wars to some degree. And so this is what inspired me to look at the lecture titled Winner versus Loser, which is a somewhat dramatic title. And I've looked at it before, but I've avoided it because it's so black and white. But when we're thinking in black and white, it felt like a good time to bring forward the pathwork perspective on such thinking. Now, the lecture, I brought in two major concepts into this lecture. One is dualistic thinking, which is part of Unity and Duality, Patrick Lecture 143, which I'll go into a bit. And the other is personality types, which I have been bringing up a lot in the last few months in an attempt to teach it sideways. In other words, I'm teaching a main point and I use reason, will, and emotion as illustrations of that point so that people can become more familiar with those concepts, which I will also explain in a few moments. I made the first draft of this video reading the slides on the handout and wasn't very happy about that. First of all, I don't like reading slides. I feel that if I write materials, you can read them. Secondly, when I read a slide, I go into that reading and I'm not aware of my senses the way I normally am. So it feels like I go into tunnel vision when I do that. And I tend to focus more on intellect than other forces. So I decided to give this another try, not show the slides, which are available for download on my website. Now, the way I wanted to start off, or that I did start off in the slide presentation, was to look at winner versus loser as a duality, part of dualistic thinking. And my first suggestion was that you take two pieces of paper and write winner and loser in the middle of each one, and then to write words surrounding that, that these words bring up for you. Now, throwing reason, will, and emotion right into the middle of that, that's the normal way to do that. It's cloud thinking. But I'm a reason, will type, will reason type, and I like to do things in a linear fashion. So I prefer lying down the middle of a page, winner, loser, and putting down my ideas in a more organized form. So let's look at those two concepts. The first is the dualistic concept of winner versus loser. To explain that, I'm going to have to talk about dualistic thinking for a few minutes. Dualistic thinking can sound like a very complex concept, and I tend to boil it down as quickly as possible into one choice represents something that is life affirming. Life for short, but life affirming. It doesn't have to be literal life, but it needs to be an affirmation of your life force. It needs to be a place where you can carry forwards, where you can move, where you can exercise yourself, see yourself, be more of yourself. Whether that's faith, values, beliefs, writing, managing, being an engineer, it doesn't matter what that's about. It's an expression of your life force and it's freeing for you. It feels enlivening. And that's always one side of the equation. Whether or not you name it or not, the other side of duality is death. Now, sometimes we can name death, and where we go to get away from that is the life affirming part, even if it's meager, even if it's thin or poverty stricken or not the best choice. Anything is better than death. A lot of times, however, we're in a life affirming place without fully identifying what we're afraid of. And another illustration that I use to represent this, so that we're not talking abstractly about theoretical things, is death is always the monster in the closet. It's in our imagination. We know it's bad. We certainly don't want to open that door and see it. And that gives it its power. It's not well defined, and therefore it can be exaggerated. It can be imagined as powerful when it actually doesn't have any power. So we give it power by not wanting to address it. And so when I work with people, I work to bring up whatever it is they're afraid of, what they don't want, what they are concerned about, to give it words to verbalize so we have something to work with. So during this talk, whenever I talk about duality, I'm going to refer to life and death, and that's what I mean. So the explanation's a little long and snarly, but life-death is the polarity. Now, in dualistic thinking, without realizing it, we don't look in the middle, and we don't look on the edges. We really only look at a choice between two things. Another way of describing this would be that if there used to be a cartoon when I was a kid of a painter or floor finisher who has painted himself into a corner. And the problem is, what do I do now? In real life, you may have to wait for the paint to dry, or you may have to walk through it and cover it up later. In spiritual work, what we're looking at is, how did that happen in the first place? What were you thinking when you walked in the room? What was your plan? Or were you so filled with enthusiasm for doing the work that you gave no thought whatsoever as to what was happening until you realized you had painted yourself into a corner? This is another way of looking at crisis. Now, there's a lecture, The Spiritual Meaning of Crisis, Catholic Lecture 183, that talks about it in those same terms, that crisis is the result of a very large number of decisions that you've made, so that you've backed yourself into a corner, and at a given moment in time, there may only be two choices, or maybe only one choice, either live with it or make a choice. But when you present that as the problem, you're ignoring how you got there. So while it is frustrating for people, when I say, no, we need to back up a little bit. Yes, but I have this problem. Yes, you do. And you'll continue to have problems like that if we don't look at how that problem came to be. Another way of describing this comes from Catholic Lecture 196, Commitment, Cause, and Effect. And we are very often dealing with the effect. And we don't know what the cause is. It's vague, it doesn't seem connected, we can't quite name it. So we focus all our attention on the effect. The problem is, if the cause is still active, the effect will continue to be recreated, or other effects will be created, and we'll be chasing effects all the time, and the cause is just merely producing more. So in this work, we're more interested in backing up and seeing a larger picture than making the yes or no, now or later choice that many of us feel. That's when we feel the crunch. That's when we realize something has gone wrong. So there, you do the best you can. And then it takes time to take this apart. So back to duality, life versus death. When we hit a moment of crisis, we may have created a situation where there's only two choices. And we may need to make that unfortunate choice in the moment. And again, the question is, how did you get there? So in the slides, I suggested several analogies to this. My favorite is Romeo and Juliet. Why? Because the norm is to not understand why young people would kill themselves. At least older people have that. Young people seem to understand the problem better than older people because they're at that age of all or nothing. But with age and maturity, we say, well, things could be worked out and there's other options and you could do this and you could do that. But when you're talking about 14 and 16-year-olds, they see the next 2 years as an enormous amount of time. It's a lifetime to them. And they don't know that opportunities can be recreated. They have not had that experience. So looking at it from that point of view, if you believe your beloved is dead, let me back that up. If living in life means separation, permanent separation, banishment from your beloved, and this is the only deep, meaningful love you've ever felt in your life, then you may feel that you're being killed. Part of you is dying. So living life becomes a living death. And in that situation, what we do is we rewire our definitions of what's going on. And the idea of physical death becomes spiritual life. So you either have a living death separate from your beloved, or a spiritual life with the possibility of reunion. And given those two possibilities, if we boil it down to life or death, a young person might see things quite differently than an older person. So that when I explain it this way, in general, I get an aha from people because it looks like they're dying when they're actually reaching for life. And that, to me, is the key for understanding a lot of the paradoxes that Pathwork talks about, is we think one thing, but we're actually doing something else. And if we can understand that, then we can see the pieces involved differently. And the term I use for that is these are subjective perceptions. My reaction to a word, a situation, is far more subjective than we would imagine. So that you and I can use the same words for something, and you think it's wonderful, and I think it's terrible. Same word, same description, same situation. Depends on my experience. Depends on my goals. It depends on how it meets my needs, what I perceive about it, where I think I can go with it, as to whether I see a situation positively or negatively. So let's come back to life or death, winner versus loser. So the presumption is that winning is life and losing is death. That's a pretty universal understanding of this. Why? Because in a single contest, the winner gains popularity, they gain notoriety, they gain adulation, admiration, they may win prize money, they may gain privilege, they gain a lot. And the loser loses out on this. Now, that doesn't mean that they're discarded, but in a given situation where there's one winner and one loser, there's an advantage to winning. It is rare to laud the loser. Now, we can try to do that, but still on a one-on-one contest, we all feel the sting of not being able to achieve a superior performance, to win. So rather than argue with the total value of winning versus losing, winner versus loser is enmeshed in our mind, in our society, in how things work, so that the idea of being a loser is not a goal that most people have. Once again, unless they change the meaning of that word. Now, I go into a few other examples, and the idea is that what happens is if you have a winner-loser situation and you don't win, then what we do is we redefine the position of the loser. Now, what I did when I did my winner versus loser is I put words for winner, words for loser. And I'm going to read them off as examples. So winner to me is popular, approved of, admired, envied, powerful, good, strong, a decision maker, They control resources. They are best. Those are the words that came to me. Under loser, I put lonely, poor, weak, no power, not supported, cannot achieve goals, takes what's left over, scapegoat, sacrificed, and has to obey the rules. So I don't think I'm that unusual. Your list will be different. These are my subjective words that come up for me in winner versus loser. Now I'm going to ignore the winning words because if you won, you may not be worried about this. As a general rule, the people that could use a little counseling are the losers. Okay, so if we take the list of loser words that I wrote, and the first one I wrote was lonely. That's based on my experience. When I lose out, I feel lonely. I feel separated. I don't feel met. All the attention is going to the winner. There's a way of turning loneliness into all the eyes aren't on me. I get to do what I want. We re-see the negative, the deficit. We see it into a positive. If a loser is poor, then I don't have the task of having to handle the money. I was teasing somebody the other day about how they said, well, I'd like to win. I said, really? You'd like to win the lottery? And they said, oh, that's right. Because the lottery, when we were talking about it, it's something like 400 million. They knew immediately what would happen. If you got 400 million suddenly to deal with, you'd have the work and responsibility of figuring out what to do with that. So sometimes being poor means you don't have to deal with the responsibility. You can point at others and expect them to do something about it. So you can turn the poor into a strength, a tactic, a way to get people to take care of you, that if you won the $400 million, you wouldn't be able to do. Weak, no power, not supported. Imagine those words also being a way to be turned against the norm so that they aren't necessarily negative. They're more levers by which you can get what you want. I'm very weak. Could you reach for that for me? Instead of being a hulking person with great arm strength that would be expected to take care of it themselves. Cannot achieve goals, takes what's left over. Once again, the invisible in that is that I don't have to take responsibility for what I'm doing. It's all I can do. It's the leftovers. So that I may not have to declare or defend or be seen in what I do as a loser. What I'm trying to describe is that sometimes people will lose on purpose, consciously or unconsciously, because they see being a loser as a freer use of their life force than winning is. But because winning has so many positives culturally and in terms of popularity and so forth, it's very difficult to turn down winning. This is a place where we may sabotage ourselves. And we would sabotage ourselves because although we're expected to admire the concept of winning, we don't. We just don't. We may not know why. We just don't want it. If that's very, very unconscious, we just interfere with ourselves. We can't muster the energy to win the race. We can't muster the concentration to write the essay. So what I'm building here is an argument for winner versus loser is dualistic, it's simplistic. It doesn't deal with the complexity of the human emotional, intellectual, and spiritual system. And it is very subjective. But again, it's easy if you can just reduce it down to life or death. The question is, does winning give you more opportunities for life, or does losing give you more opportunities for life? So that's just looking at winner versus loser. One of the things, by the way, that happened when I started to read this lecture is I got to around the 4th page and realized I had so much material. My head was going off like fireworks. So that this will be a 2-parter, and I'll do the second part on the interplay between self and creative forces in May. So the material I'm talking about here, I was inspired by simply the first few pages of the lecture, and that's how powerful this concept feels to me. It feels very loaded. It brings in the unity versus duality concept. When I bring in reason, will, and emotion, it also seems to fit in perfectly with this concept. Reason, will, and emotion, personality types, Pathwick Lecture 43. References to this are in the slides in terms of Pathwick Lecture numbers. Reason, will, and emotion are a way of, for me, of understanding the impetus behind what people want and what they want to avoid. I've been mystified by people my whole life. I just didn't understand them. I tried to understand, but it didn't formulate, it didn't gel. I was guessing a lot. When I came along, when I was well over 40, and I found the Pathwick concept of reason, will, and emotion, it supplied to me the missing information. The reason I want some things in a certain way is because I'm a certain blend of types. The reason my father wanted things in a certain way is he's a different blend of these same types. And my mother was another different blend of these types. So by understanding reason, will, and emotion, I began to see in a bigger sense the clashes and conflicts between people, where they were using the same words, but they didn't mean the same thing. And the words didn't carry the weight of life versus death for them. And this is where this lecture has brought all these 3 concepts together for me. And that's how I have been presenting it. So reason, will, and emotion is a big topic. I have lots of videos. I have lots of previous study guides and outlines and charts, and there are charts in this handout. And so it's always divided into 3 columns, reason, will, and emotion, usually going this way with different blocks. And the idea is that the different types exhibit different characteristics because they have a different basis, a spiritual gift. Now, as I talk about reason, will, and emotion, because it's just too complicated to talk about a real person here that you don't know and don't want to talk about me. So we're going to talk about generic, but people aren't generic. So bear with me when I talk about a type. And the truth is that we are blends, infinitely adjustable blends. And these blends will change from decade to decade and situation to situation. So this is not a who am I type of evaluation. This is about understanding what the force is, what the urgency is, where the life energy wants to go, what it wants to avoid, and what it wants to obtain. So reason, will, and emotion. I usually do everything in that order just to keep it clear. So the reason type, their spiritual gift, their ultimate spiritual gift, what they're aiming for or what they're bringing, or both, so you may bring some and want to develop more, is wisdom. For the will type, their spiritual gift is courage and leadership. And for the emotion type, it's love. Love and genuine connection. Now, from these 3 different gifts come a multitude of possible wonderful outcomes. For the reason type, there is not only wisdom, there's clarity, order, and understanding that is intuitive, but in a very special way. For the will type, the courage and leadership enables them to take risks, and hopefully with some wisdom in that risk-taking and some consideration from others. So these are really blend together. And for the emotion type, real love and connection brings along, I forget the term, but they're people who bring people together and who rally and cheerlead and keep us all on the same track and help us feel that we all belong together. They have a tremendous ability to bring happiness and joy to the human race. There is no bad choice. There is no one's better than the other. So that's their gift. Along with every gift, you can imagine there's a weakness, and there's a way to defend, and there's a concern, there's a fear. And so again, in the handouts, I've listed these down. This is not something that's easy to just talk about. It's easier to look at the charts. What I wanted to introduce was the softness with which I invite you to look at these. Not to look at what am I, but I have that quality. I usually use that quality over here. I have this quality. I tend not to use it very much. This quality gives me an issue. I'm working on it. So the way I think of these is primary, secondary, and the one we're working on. Now that may be true for some people and not for others. Another way to look at this is Pathwork proposes that we come here multiple times. There are multiple incarnations. You don't have to believe that, but that's in the Pathwork texts. If we come here multiple times, I may come here with a strong right arm in one lifetime, and the next lifetime I may tie my right arm behind my back so that I will develop my left arm. So that who we are in a given lifetime may not reflect who we are in our entire whole spiritual nature. It reflects what this lifetime is meant to work on, to develop, to transform. So again, I invite you to be very soft and generous with these terms, but I have found them extremely useful. Now, how does that fit in with winner and loser? Because the different types would see winning differently, and they would see losing differently. For instance, the reason type would see winning as winning an argument, winning their point, having others accept their view of the universe and work with it. So it wasn't disturbed, it was built upon. But their idea of something to be afraid of would be chaos, irrationality. And so reason types tend to fear emotion because emotion cannot be seen as clearly as intellectual items can be seen. It cannot be it is not as orderly. It is not as definable as the things in life. So a reason type might be a librarian or a scientist or even a business manager or a financier, where they know when they win and they know when they lose. And it's crystal clear. And they like that. They don't like losing, but at least they feel they understand what's going on. The will type likes being in control. They like being in charge. They like leading. And their fear is to be weak or helpless. And yet perhaps in your life, you have experienced a level of weakness or helplessness that allowed others to assist you. It created community, it created connection. But that's not what the will type's after. It's not after community or connection. It's about being in charge so that it's not helpless. So a strictly will type would not appreciate the value of being helped when they were weak. They'd only see the weakness. The emotion type, who has a great deal of love and desire for connection, most fears disconnection. Isolation, not even technically, but not being liked or admired or approved of. And they also connect love with pleasure, which of course love brings pleasure. But pleasure does not necessarily bring love. So sometimes we go down the road of the effect of our gift, and it doesn't give us what we think we're going to get. Same thing with the reason type, who thinks that order will bring a sense of clarity and wisdom, and they wind up being somewhat anal or bureaucratic, and they don't get what they're looking for. And the same with the will type, looking for power and chasing everybody away and having nobody to lead. So these are just examples of how these three types can go after a similar goal, but they'll go about it in dissimilar ways, and they are afraid of different aspects of that goal. Now, this affects how you perceive winning versus losing. One of the things that I found when I made my list was that I consider myself a loser. Now, other people may consider that I'm a winner in life, and they can make their own list. Why do I consider myself a loser? I'm of a minority opinion on the planet. I would say that pathworkers in general are a minority opinion on the planet. I'm old, so I'm not as effective as I could have been or was when I was younger and engaged in industry and engaged in life and raising children and interacting with other people. I feel I exercise far less power as a senior citizen, retired person than I ever did. I also am somewhat set in my ways. And perhaps those of you who are older will appreciate that we're just not as flexible as we were when we were younger. I have been through a lot of experimentation in my life, and I know what I like and I know what I don't like. And so my field of enjoyment is smaller than it was earlier. It doesn't mean that I'm deprived. It's just a little narrower. And that can bring on a sense of loneliness because there aren't that many people who have my particular interests, who are my age, who have my financial capacities, who have my time schedule, et cetera, et cetera. So I was surprised to realize that there was a lot of me that looked at the loser column, and I actually identify with the loser, but I don't see that as deadly. And that's where I came to the realization that they may not be the best qualities, but they're my qualities, and I'm going to make the best of them as I can. So that is an example of subjective perception, both of winning and losing, and using reason, will, and emotion as a tool to understand where somebody's coming from, where you're coming from. But I like the idea that you can look at other people without judging them, but simply to analyze, what are you after? What makes you happy? What makes you enthusiastic? What is life affirming to you, and what do you not want to touch? And then seeing that in the context of reason, will, and emotion. So that leads me into a third topic, which is subjective views of power. And I've touched on this. While some people think that power is something that everybody wants, powerful people think everybody wants power. But look at the planet, not everybody wants power. So there's a subjective view of power that some people want it because they believe it's life affirming. They believe it's going to give them what they want. It's going to allow them to exhibit their real selves, bring their spirituality into full bloom on the planet. And then there are people who believe that that opportunity will only come through losing, and that the winning would get in the way. And it turns into an aversion to power. Now, why does this matter? When we talk about power, we're talking about one element of the three. We're talking about will, self-will, personal will. If you decide to cripple this, if you decide to not develop this because you have an aversion to power based on experience, preference, characterology, whatever it is, if you have an aversion to power and you don't develop it, it creates a weakness, because both emotion and reason need will to sustain them, to carry them, to help them to do what they need to do. In the world, we are all doing something. So an aversion to power is going to potentially disable one or both of the others. So aversion to power is something that would be important for all of us to understand about ourselves. Where are we averse to actually holding power and exercising power? Now you can say, oh, I just don't want to do it over there. I don't want to lead groups. This work is about personal transformation, and that is a form of leadership. So if we are averse to leadership, we may be averse even to leading our own spiritual lives. And this is a form of crippling ourselves. We may not realize it. Once again, cause and effect. In Patrick Lecture 196 on cause and effect, the guide says that as you develop, cause and effect come closer and closer together until it's easier to see the connection. That when cause and effect are too far apart, or one is invisible, unconscious, then you're floundering and you don't know what's going on. Think of a scientist who sees an effect but doesn't know what's causing it. How can you control that effect if you don't know what's causing it? And our inner lives are very much a series of cause and effect. So the idea is to bring this forward. Now, in the last few months, we've done a lot of study, a lot of the lectures that I've been focusing on are about this kind of unconsciousness, and it scares people. They will literally say in the weekly meetings, they will say, I'm afraid of the unconscious. But we have an unconscious. This is what I meant about the monster in the closet. If you're afraid of your unconscious, you're not going to do the work of sorting and looking for where it's starting to come forward. You're going to avert your gaze and go do something else and ignore the information you can get and the cause and effect connections that can be seen. So the idea is to be afraid of your unconscious means you simply won't deal with it, just like being afraid of power means that you won't take on personal power because of that prejudice. So that section was about the subjective evaluation of power in both winning and losing. And the last section was in the slide handout was a little bit more fun. When I present reason, will, and emotion, people may or may not connect with that. It matter of taste, matter of understanding, and a lot of other things. And so every once in a while, I find other ways of doing this that I enjoy. I'm not much on enneagrams. It's just me. It's very valuable. There are dozens of other ways of understanding characterology of the human being in generics that allow you to differentiate and see different aspects of human behavior from. The one that I found that I used for this was from a very slim book called Signs of Life. And the author of the book had done a lot of archaeological research for other books that they'd written. And they discovered that there were universal shapes in different cultures. And the universal shapes are circle, square, triangle, equilateral, cross, and spiral. Not only are these used across many, many cultures around the world, they have similar meanings. Now, I don't know about their study. I'm just taking that as, I accept what they say. So they've got these universal signs that tend to mean the same thing in many cultures. And so they use this as a way of trying to understand human characteristics. And he calls it a preferential, let me see if I get the words right, preferential shapes test. And once again, it's outlined, but this is what it looks like, is you've got the 5 shapes, and then you number them 1 through 5. You do that before you go any further because you don't want to prejudice yourself. And my reaction when I heard the test was, what do you mean preference? Why would I prefer a triangle over a square over, but honestly, when I said it, I realized I do. I don't value triangles as much as I do circles. And it's using your intuition. And you may not be great at it, but you've got to start someplace perhaps. And this is an innocent way to start. So I wound up numbering these. And then the book tells you what the meaning of the numbers are. And then it tells you what the meaning of the shapes are. So you have to put it together on one page as you go through it. And the idea was that the first shape tends to mean the first shape means this. And if it's number one, that's what you're aiming towards. Now, I don't want to go into this because it's part of the handout, but you get the idea. Why was that intriguing to me? It was recommended by another source I was reading, and I bought the book a year ago, and I took the little test and I wrote it all out, and I wasn't impressed, and I put it away. For reasons I don't understand, when I was preparing for this, for the workshop this week, I got it out again, and I simply started over, did the shapes, did the numbers, read all the text, put it all together. And this time it felt more relevant to me. Perhaps the first time I did it, I wasn't as good at being honest about my preference for shapes. Maybe I talked myself into thinking I admired squares over spirals or vice versa. Also, I may not have recognized the meaning a year ago, as well as I recognized the meaning today, but I found the answers relevant in order to say, this is where you're going, this is where you are, this is what you got you there, this is what you haven't dealt with yet, and this is what you may be resisting. I found it useful. So I included it for two reasons. Any self-analysis, any self-evaluation is going to be of value. It's good if it's worthy instead of silly. It's practice. So think of it like you read books for practice. You don't read every book to improve your mind. You read very often to improve your ability to read. It's important to be very familiar with reading so that you will read and you will then find something that you appreciate reading about. So I brought this up partly so that if people weren't interested in reason, will, and emotion, they might be interested in something else, because the same concept applies. What do I mean by that? If the test tells me that this shape, which means spirituality, is something I resist, my first question is that true? Now, there's an intellectual surface reality that says, no, I don't think that's true. And the hard work is realizing that there may be a part of me where it's true. And the idea is there are some tests, some ways of doing things that will be better at revealing your unconsciousness than other ways. So I put this up as an example. If we're studying winning versus losing and duality, it is important to find out what we don't want to know, because it's going to block us from knowing. So it's not about, well, I don't know what my unconscious is because it's unconscious and therefore I can't access it. This is that stuff that's coming up, and we deliberately repress or put aside or mislabel. So what I do work with people, very often what I find is that they will put a word on something and it's the wrong word. And that creates a distraction. It disables them from really looking at what's going on because they put the wrong word on it. They've called something mean when it was, terse tense is not the right word. They'll call something mean when it was simply, I'll use the word brutal. It was blunt. It wasn't intended as mean, it was blunt. It can be interpreted as mean, and it can be used meanly. But to be blunt is not to be mean. And if we overlay one word over the other, we are able to ignore the message, because why should I listen to somebody who's mean to me? It's quite different than why should I listen to somebody who ignores the niceties and just lays something out that I don't want to hear. So to some extent, all of this is related in the sense of the pathwork is about finding out who we are, what we want to do, and then attempting to enable the best parts of that, to minimize our negativity, to find the reasons for our negativity and give ourselves a bit of a talking to, see if we can soften that up, see if we can release ourselves from negative beliefs or negative experiences that influence our perceptions. And ultimately, the reason winner versus loser is such a harsh, blunt, and mean phrase is because it presumes that there are losers. To presume a winner means there's a loser. To presume there's a loser means there's a winner. The idea in spiritual work is there are no winners and losers. Nobody loses, but nobody wins either. Someone may be more developed than me, but that's, I don't know the full story of that. I don't know where they came from, what they're trying to do. I don't even know what I'm trying to do. So to use a simplistic relay race mentality to try to determine the developmental level of two human beings is a bit arrogant. It presumes you know what you're talking about, or I'll take credit for that, presumes I know what I'm talking about. So I try not to judge because I have no right to judge, and I don't have the information I would need to judge. This is also in the Pathwork lectures. So the mere title, winner versus loser, is about a superficial, simplistic, dualistic way of thinking that Pathwork encourages us to take some steps back from. So that's my explanation. Hope you will take a look at the handout. Hope you will take a look at the lecture. Pathwork Lecture 129, winner versus loser, interplay between the self and the creative forces. And next month in May, we'll do self and creative forces because of the juiciness of the first few pages. So thank you for listening. Take care.